Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the Education Secretary's announcement that schools will fully reopen this September, even though there is no plan. But don't worry, the plan is coming. But that means there isn't a plan right now. And what that means for teachers, because I can speak of that from first-hand experience. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, first of all, let's get a couple of things out of the way. Boris Johnson says that schools are safe. He doesn't seem to be able to get his own scientific advisors to acknowledge this, but never mind. And the Education Secretary has announced that all schools will fully reopen. That's all students from September. Now, there have been some schools open partially already. And it was interesting to note this weekend that one has had to close because members of the school, now I'm not entirely sure whether it's staff or students. I read a report that seemed to suggest it was staff. It may have been a combination of staff and pupils in a primary school, have tested positively for COVID. A number of them as well, not just one. In other words, very high likelihood that someone had COVID from somewhere and brought it into the school, and then other people contracted it in the school. And that's with a partially opened primary school, open to just a couple of year groups and a few from those couple of year groups. There you go. Let's imagine what's going to happen when it all opens up. But that's not what I'm really going to focus on here. So let me explain the process at the moment. So at the moment, I mean, I'm sort of full-time doing this, but I do a little bit of part-time teaching at a college. And I'm going to be doing more of that. I've said I'll cover for someone from September, so we'll worry about what that's going to mean here. I'll still be doing the channel, of course. I'll be a bit busier. But planning would already have started by now anyway, and we have been planning at this particular college, and we've been discussing how we're going to go about it. And you've got to bear in mind, we can't just go, right, divvy up the classes, do your planning, or even plan in teams, because that's what would normally happen. That can't happen this year because we have one of three scenarios. Scenario one, much as we exist now, you can only get in a large room 5 or 6 students in it, with the 2 metre social distancing, including space for the teacher as well. And you can plan for that, but that basically means you're going to have a small number of people in the class. Virtually everyone else is going to be watching from home. So you bring in the ones whose IT isn't that great at home. That's one way of doing it. Now, no one really believes that's the situation we're going to find ourselves in September. So scenario 2, which is more realistic, because the government are already talking about reducing the distancing by 1 metre. So we were also planning for that. Now that could include up to 40% of students going back, and planning for how you would do that. That's still going to mean a lot of students at home. How do you manage that? Because you're going to need all teachers in there. It's one thing to ask teachers to do stuff remotely, and it's another thing to ask them to go in and teach. It's quite another thing to ask them to go in and teach, but also still deal with all the ones at home. I mean, where's the time for it? Then there's the third scenario, which seems to be the only one that's realistic at the moment, but that doesn't mean you can discount the first two, because the Education Secretary has said that all pupils are going back. Now, consider what that means. All pupils going back means it's the same as beforehand. It's all right them saying, but they still need to socially distance. There will be no social distancing. In a lot of schools, you're crammed in like sardines. You are, crammed in, shoulder to shoulder. That's the reality of it. Except it'll actually be even worse. I mean, I would say the class sizes will be back up to where they were, but they'll actually be higher, because consider this. There are going to be members of staff who become ill with COVID and have to isolate. Or there'll be members of staff who a member of their household, for example, their partner, contracts COVID and they have to self-isolate. So there's going to be a higher incidence of teacher absenteeism, is what I'm saying. Which means that you have to spread out the pupils and students to a great... If you're going to go with the government's thinking, by the way, that younger people are much less likely to develop symptoms and therefore test positive, whether they've contracted it or not. They may well be contracting it and passing it around, but if they're not developing symptoms, they'll never be tested. So if you assume that the number of staff going off is going to be much higher than the proportion of students going off with COVID related things, that means actually each individual class will be higher than it was before. At which point you struggle, well, you probably can't even physically fit them in. So that's lovely. But the thing is, the way you prepare for each of those three scenarios is very, very different. Because if you're preparing for the first scenario, which is largely remote teaching, you're going to be developing a lot of video lessons and video resources and remote resources. And if you're going to be teaching roughly half classes, 40%, 50% classes, and the rest at home, then you're going to be doing a lot of taught stuff physically in there, recording it. Now, classrooms aren't fitted for recording. That means schools and colleges are going to have to buy in a lot more IT equipment, for which we'll need the government to stump up. But it makes no difference. It's needed. And we need to record ourselves so that people can access it. Well, they can hopefully watch live and ask their questions live. We're going to need a system to be able to respond to those questions live if people flag it up, text-based thing, which is all doable. But the system needs implementing. It needs paying for, because it's got to be in every classroom. And that's scenario 2. Or scenario 3, where you go back and it's your normal teaching and you just prepare as you normally do. But the thing is, you've got to prepare for each one of those 3 scenarios. And the preparation is very, very different in all 3 cases. Now, we would already, just for teaching a normal year without a global pandemic, we've already started planning for next year. And we haven't got the time to plan for all those 3 scenarios, but we don't know which one to prepare for. And it's all right saying, well, if the Education Secretary has said they're all definitely going back in September, just prepare for that one. Sure, yeah. So what happens if the government, a week before, in August, a week before everyone goes back, the circumstances have changed. It's quite clear that it's an insane thing to do. And they say, no, you're going to have to do the remote stuff. And it's like, well, bloody hell, we just prepared for going back. Which also, by the way, throws light onto the lie that the government have been telling about the reason why schools haven't reopened yet properly is because of the unions. Got nothing to do with the unions. If the government say we're all going to go back and teach full classes, we're all going to go back and teach full classes. Nothing to do with the union. The unions will, of course, raise objections. Of course they are. They're sticking up for the welfare of their members. They don't get to decide. They don't decide whether or not we get to go back. It's absolute nonsense. It's the same thing as these backbench Tory MPs saying, there's too many workers on the furlough scheme not going back to work when they're needed. No, there's not a single person in the country doing that because they'd be in breach of their contract of employment. Assuming the reason why furloughed people aren't going back is because their employers have not, even if they want them to go back, they know they cannot meet their legal obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. No such thing as a worker on furlough just telling their boss they're not going in. Otherwise, if the boss is saying, well, it's safe to come back in, I've put these measures in place, they'll be in breach of contract, sacked. Same here. Union's got nothing to do with it. In September, if we go back and do scenario 1, it's because the government have told us to. If we go back and do scenario 2, it's because the government has told us to. And if we go back and it's scenario 3, it's because the government have told us to. But the government changed their mind. They U-turned quite a lot. You may have noticed. And that is my fear. I'm looking at it and thinking, the government want us just to go back. I'm going to be planning for going in there and doing my lessons normally. And I can plan for that. And I think it's crazy. But what if a week before we go back, or even a week after, what if we start this, we do it for 2 weeks, and just like that primary school, schools across the country having to close because of large numbers of staff, a few weeks into term, are testing positive for COVID. A significant number of staff, all students, testing positive, and that means everyone that was in contact with them, which is everyone, has to self-isolate. What then? Then the government will be fumbling around and they'll be making their on-the-hoof decisions that, and letting us deal with the rest of it. That is the reality facing it. And I just thought that may be of interest to be aware of, because obviously many of you may well have children and you may well be thinking whether you want to go back to school or not. And that's another thing just to throw in the mix as well. You may have a significant number of parents who are able to keep their children off school. They don't think it's safe. And I have to say, I'm not entirely sure what's going to be done for those students, because if teachers are going back into school and teaching full time, I'm afraid they don't have time to plan a load of remote learning resources as well and have much time to do that. And it's not like we're getting any more teachers. In fact, if anything, we may find that we have an even greater shortage of teachers than we already have in the country. I mean, the teacher shortage isn't spread throughout the country. There's certain pockets of it, but there are shortages in a number of areas in the country. And, you know, this isn't going to improve it. It's not, it's, you know, just like they've moved on. You know, we initially, it's very well reported that members of the NHS, frontline NHS staff, were thrown under the bus. Many of them have lost their lives. Some may have done anyway. It's an inherently dangerous job in the middle of such a pandemic, but the fact that they weren't given the PPE they needed to keep themselves safe has not helped. And the same thing here. There is no plan to safely reopen schools. That's all there is to it. The Department of Education have not issued one. And I don't mean they've issued a plan and I just don't think it's safe. They haven't actually issued a plan. They say they're going to issue it in a couple of weeks. So I could do some more planning over the next 2 weeks and then find out, with the new guidance from the Department for Education, I might as well have thrown it in the bin and start on something else. And it's not like I can just wait, because then that's 2 more weeks gone, 2 more weeks close to the start of term for which I need to have prepared. But there it is, fun times, fun times. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further. Please also click the Patreon link for details, and until next time, I'll see you later.